My guest today is Celia. And Celia, I'm going to butcher your last name, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself. And you have a storied history in the land of CS. You've worked with Glint, with Whisk, with a number of companies to help them be successful. Please take us through a little bit of your career background and your history, and let us get rolling.
Great, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Celia Gouveia, and I've been building and leading customer success teams in the SaaS industry for over 10 years now at companies ranging from SuccessFactors, acquired by SAP, and most notably, built out the North America team at Glint, an employee engagement company, through the acquisition of LinkedIn, and was able to move to Dublin, Ireland, and build out the EMEA and Asia Pacific teams. Most recently, I was helping a startup get off the ground with their customer success process and systems called Whisk, a social platform for the workplace. And I'm currently looking for my next opportunity to help a startup or later stage company with their process and next steps to scale their CS team. So really excited to be here with you today. Thank
you, Celia. And I know you've had, both SuccessFactors acquired by SAP and Glint acquired by have been phenomenal successes and part of common vocabulary in terms of companies that we've all heard of and know what they do. So if anybody's watching this, we're kind of uniquely privileged that Celia is in that position where she's considering other options. Feel free to reach out and connect with her. We'll share her contact information a little bit later in the session, but easy to find her on LinkedIn. Okay, Celia, so let's jump right in. Let's talk a little bit about, your background, your history, and I think we'll start with Glint as the first place that we go into and dive a little bit deeper. So maybe take us through a little bit of your career trajectory there, and what are some of the accomplishments you're the most proud of?
Yeah, thank you. So I joined Glint as the first person in customer success, reporting to the CEO in the very early days, and was able to build a process, segment customers from SMB to enterprise, measure everything from their data and value to satisfaction, and create an extremely, extremely low churn and high retention over time in North America, EMEA, and APAC. And then finally was able to integrate those teams into the operational workings of LinkedIn. So great time, a lot of fun, and lots of learning along the way.
Awesome. And, I think anybody who starts as employee number one in CS brings a very unique perspective to how CS works. What do those early days look like from your lens?
Yes, so everything from being hands-on, but being extremely proactive, measuring everything possible. So how are your customers using the platform? What features and functionality are they using the most? What does data and usage look like at a certain point on the journey? So mapping out the customer journey from what do you want the customer to do from day one to what will make them the most successful at renewal, and iterating over time as you're learning about your customers and finding what they need and what helps them the most.
Great. So Celia, we have a few folks joining in. Gary Hoffman is my old friend. He is on many of our webinars and asks great questions. I see Jan Young just joined. Welcome, Jan. Laura, Travis, Sierra. Guys, please jump in, ask questions, and let us know where you're dialing in from. Let us know who you work for. Purpose of this is to build community and engage with each other. And really excited that several of you are able to join us through multiple webinars. Welcome, Margaret and Laura. So let us know again where you're dialing in from. And good morning from sunny San Diego. Gary, good to see you again. All right. And so those of you just joining in, we've got our guest today, Celia, who's going to talk to us a bit about, we're going to have a discussion around some interesting topics around NPS scores and QBRs and customer satisfaction surveys. And really the essence of it is, how do you build positive and great relationships with your clients? And some of the methodologies that we take for granted, do they really work? And if they do, then in what context? And what are some of the new ways of approaching these things? So anybody who's been on this webinar before, we welcome questions. So please jump in, ask your questions of Celia or myself, and we're happy to address those. If you're open to it, we'll open your line and we'll let you ask questions directly as well. Okay, so let's kind of continue, Celia, into our conversation. So let me maybe shift gears a little bit. We were kind of going through the introduction. For those of you who didn't catch that, Celia has been at SuccessFactors. She's been at Glint, both companies that had very successful acquisitions. And she's just rolling off of a project with a company called Whisk and starting to engage in new opportunities. So bear that in mind for the folks who just joined us. All right, Cecilia, tell us a little bit more about this whole idea of building relationships with customers. When you kind of break that apart, how do you tend to think of it? Like from a customer success perspective, what's sort of your thought process? What's your framework in which you think about the problem?
Yeah, for me, relationships are everything. So whether that's internally at your organization or with your customers, really building rapport and understanding that the person on the other side of the screen or call is a human helps with a likelihood of coming to a mutual understanding. We all know there's going to be a point where there may be a potential disagreement, or should I even say escalation, that could arise. And having that rapport and understanding of the other person as a human really helps you continue to stay on track and work towards positive solutions together. Some examples of this are when you're starting out in onboarding, to ask people, not too personal questions, but I typically start by sharing more personal information about myself. I'll share that I love my Peloton, that I have 2 small little girls that keep me occupied. And sometimes that opens up the line for people to share more. I just got a puppy, and people start to share about their family or food or where they may be traveling to. And I continue to build off that and encourage my teams to over time, and actually take notes on it so you can remember those little bits when you're thinking of people for your next meeting.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more on the importance of building relationships. I think pretty much anything I've accomplished in my career has been because of positive relationships and support I received from people I work with. That I think in the context of individual interactions works really well, but when you're thinking organizationally and you're thinking more broadly, take us a little bit through some of the frameworks and how you think about like different ways in which to measure success and how your customers are engaging with you. And what are the ways in which as a CS leader that you set up those processes, et cetera, for your team?
Absolutely. So I actually believe this starts in pre-boarding. So before the customers even signed up, whether they're going through a sales cycle or whether they're coming through more of a product-led growth model on a website, self-serve, really the idea here is that you're collecting what will make the customer most successful. What's their use case? Why are they purchasing you? And how will they measure success? I love to know that information up front and measure against that over time. So if I know the exact use case of why a customer purchased us, what pain point we're trying to solve, and how will they know that they've solved it, that gives me so much to go off of, the data points to measure that we are trending and meeting this over time.
Very interesting point that you just made about from a CS lens, starting with pre-onboarding and sort of figuring out why is it that they really purchase us, what's their pain point. How do you reconcile that with, typically there's, in a traditional model, there's a sales team that's engaged, they've typically oversold the solution footprint already. And then, they hand it off to the CS organization to help them carry through and be successful. What does that handoff look like? What's a good handoff from your perspective? What are some of the challenges you might expect to see in that handoff?
Yes, I have definitely been there along the way and learned a lot, and have built such great partnerships with some of the sales leaders I've been fortunate to partner with. So for me, whatever system sales is using, I found is the only system they're going to use. So don't make them come into another system or a customer success system, but let them, right when they're closing an opportunity, have specific questions that they need to answer that are required in order to close that opportunity. So that information is handed off to the customer success team. Depending on customer size and complexity, then making sure there is a handoff internal warm call with a set template, things that we normally need to know, and taking that information and then putting it into the initial implementation. So whether you have a kickoff call or email, whatever method you're delivering this, I like to reconfirm with the customer. So as we heard from, this sales rep, this is what you're looking for, this is why, and reiterating that information. And if the sales team knows that on your first call or email with the customer, you are going to reiterate what they've told you, they are more likely to not write TBD or NA to get through those required fields, because, it only helps them to have the customer be successful Another thing I do is back to the relationships, I measure referenceable customers. So we always have a field that helps sales and marketing with who is a reference for what and how often we've used them. So the sales team now knows that if they've created this successful handoff from the beginning in entering the right information and sharing what they know, asking the right pre-boarding questions, that their customer that they've sold to is more likely to be a reference. And what does sales want? They want more deals.
Yep.
And so if they're a reference, they're more likely to refer other customers and they can use the customer again. So, it's a win-win all around.
100%. And TBD and NA are my two least favorite responses to any question. So totally with you on that. Okay, so I want to shift gears. And for folks in the audience, please jump in, ask questions as we go. You can either post those directly into the webinar chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll invite you into the conversation. So the discussion today is really around, NPS scores and understanding that. So I know a lot of people really at a high level understand that NPS reflects customer satisfaction, but maybe, there's so much more nuance to it. So, take us through that a little bit. Like, how is NPS measured? What are some of the nuances for people to be aware of?
Yeah, so basically the Net Promoter Score is a survey that goes out on a certain frequency, either to all of your customers or a subset of your customers. And it measures a point in time, one question. So how likely they are to recommend your company, whether it be to a friend or family or colleague, whatever wording you'd like to use there. And it's on a 0 to 10 scale. Once you get the data, then you look at how people answered it. And simply people who answered the top two numbers, a 9 or 10, are deemed as promoters. Those who answered between a 0 to 6 are detractors. And those in the middle, 7, 8, are known as being neutral. So you take that percentage and basically come up with this number of, this is what we think our customers say about us. This is the percent of people that are actively promoting us and the percent of people actively detractors. And this has been used for a very long time as a single source of truth. And, I really question the value it provides with so many other metrics and data points out there that are more predictive and proactive rather than being a point in time measurement.
Got it. So look, the concept of a single question and a single score is very appealing in that it simplifies and standardizes, more importantly, kind of standardizes the response to the question. And then, I know like on the consumer side, it's been used a certain way, but do you really feel like on the B2B side, are there certain situations where it works and there's certain situations where it doesn't work? And how do you sort of aggregate the point that, there are typically multiple personas and users in a B2B organization that will perceive the product or the relationship in a very different way? So how do you peel those things apart, right? Like, just maybe take a little bit of a nuanced view in that direction.
Yeah, so there's so many different factors that go into this. Exactly. You could be asking an end user, you could be asking a leader, you could be asking the initial decision maker who's never ever used the product again. You also could be asking someone who on that day had maybe a very bad commute or an internet issue or, was very frustrated with the product, but the next day they were having the best experience of their life. So for me, the Net Promoter Score skews to the extremes. I always like to think of this analogy. Imagine you ate at a restaurant that day and someone said, is this the absolute best food you've ever had? And would you tell everyone to eat here again? Great, you're a promoter. Or is this the worst food you would tell people to never eat here? Great, you're a detractor. You don't feel strongly either way? All right, we'll just put you in passive. And I like to think, ask that again in 2 weeks, 2 months, even 6 months. How much would that change? It would vary widely depending on the day I'm having, the mood I'm in, heck, maybe even the type of food I feel like that day. And so I think that analogy really sums up how using Net Promoter Score as only one piece of data without having other pieces to measure the true feeling of a customer over a period of time can lead people astray.
Got it. So the other sort of important kind of point I think I heard you bring up in this conversation is that there is a time element to the NPS score. Today I might be a detractor, tomorrow I might be a promoter, and the day after I might be neutral. what's the appropriate frequency at which to poll, and what are some of the factors that you should account for to determine what that frequency should be?
Yeah, it absolutely depends on the number of customers you have, because you want to have enough customers and data points to have trend lines. This isn't as much about the individual customer, which is an important point to look at, but the trends over time. So let's say you have less than 500 customers, for instance. In my experience, you may be asking everyone at the same time quarterly or twice a year to get their feedback. You may also either exclude people that have not implemented yet, or maybe are in the first 90 days of signing. So you're getting a true feeling of how it's going. That also is controversial, whether you should be excluding people who have not implemented yet, or is their experience just as valid if they're going through the implementation process. But knowing that for trending of where the customer is on the journey is really important. As you start to scale and grow and you have multiple customers, maybe over 500 and up, you start to look at surveying customers at different points in time. So breaking up your customers, sometimes it's a sampling of all different types of customers twice a year, and the other customers are at the different frequency. And you look at what does the trend look like? So is timing as important as it is where the customer is and what they're saying in terms of how they would to recommend you?
Got it. Got it. So Celia, when you advise startups, at what stage do you recommend, what stage of their customer acquisition process do you recommend that they start measuring NPS? Or is there some minimum number of customers where it makes sense, and then below that it's like, why would you ever do that? Obviously, like, if I have 10 customers, I know how they're doing, but if I have 100, that's now getting into a tricky. So what's the cutoff? Like, what's the right way to think about that?
Yeah, this one depends so much, but it's such a good question. In my head, it's 50 customers and up. I've heard 100 and up, but really what it depends on is, do you have a pulse on how your customers are feeling at a point in time? And do you have that for a certain number of customers? We know with 10 customers, it's very subjective. You're collecting other pieces of data, but also someone is likely on top of talking to them very often, knowing exactly how they're feeling. So if they received a survey, they would almost wonder why, because they're usually talking to you so much. You start to get a 50 and up, depending on how many people are on your team and how often you're speaking with customers. You may want to start collecting data. And then for me, truly 100 and up is, where you really need to get that pulse and start to understand what's happening, whether that be NPS as one point of data, but certainly other data points as well.
Okay, got it. So now, what are some of the challenges with the NPS score? We just heard when to use it, when sort of, how it works. What are some of the that you get a good pulse on your customers, that has some obviously issues with, the day of that you decide to pulse. Are they in the right mindset? Are they having a good experience? So what are some of the challenges, and what are the alternatives?
Yeah, so other challenges besides it being a point of time are, it's typically reactive. So you're asking someone about how their experience has been to date. And we often know once somebody is a passive or a detractor or just not a huge fan, it's much harder to turn them around than to have predictive measures where you can proactively understand where a customer is and get ahead of it. It's always harder to be behind. So for me, it's a very reactive metric, whereas alternatives, predictors would be things like time to onboard, usage, percent utilization, looking at support interactions, features and functionality being used. I like to stay ahead of it by looking at all the predictive data. And then even if you are using NPS as point in time, there aren't any surprises. You don't want to all of a sudden 6 months in ask a customer and say, oh no, they're extremely unhappy and we had no idea why. Thank goodness we did the survey. You want to have all the data leading up to that to know that they could potentially become unhappy, know how to solve it, have the right playbooks, action, and interventions before you get to that point where they're so unhappy, it's much harder to come back from.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Just had a thought for our audience. Quick question. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. The first question is, and it's a yes/no response. Do you use NPS scores in your organization or in your work? Because I know there's a couple of consultants that are on the call with us in some way. Just yes or no. If you could just post that on there, it'd be super helpful to just get a pulse of how you guys are thinking. And then I'll ask you my second question, which will make you laugh, but we'll go there in a moment right after we see some responses here. So quick, the question is, Do you use NPS scores today in your work in some way? Yes or no? That's just the response we're looking for. So Margaret says, no, not yet. And Jan, hopefully you got the question. I'm happy to repeat that again. No surveys, yes. Okay, great. We'll talk about surveys in a moment. Laura says, yes, she does use it today. Other responses, Margaret, thank you for yours. Yeah, Gary, if you have a response, that'd be great. Sierra. Okay. And then the other question I'm curious about is, Gary, thank you. Never met an exec that did not want NPS. Couldn't agree with you more on that. I've been in many situations where we've had very nuanced debates with execs, and it takes up a lot of time, and I'm not sure it's worth the debate that ends up happening over it, to be honest. Okay, now the next question I would ask you, would you recommend the NPS scoring methodology to your friends and your colleagues? So let's use their approach to ask that question. Just yes or no. Would you recommend?
We'd love to see our promoters and detractors here.
Yes. Okay.
And I would say, to a point, and
Jen says CEOs want NPS scores because investors want NPS, does not recommend NPS. Okay, great. Okay, so curious to learn, want to hear more about how people are trying different methodologies. So I want to go back, Celia, to what you just said a minute ago about the idea of taking data from a variety of different data sources. So you mentioned product usage, time to adopt, bugs or issues or tickets filed by the client. What are some of the other signals that you seek from a data standpoint? And how do you then turn that signal into something that is useful and actionable for a CS team? So that's the second part of the conversation. We'll come back to in a moment. Jen says, clarifying, I recommend NPS for B2C, but not B2B. Okay, that's a really good clarification, Jen. I think we sort of assumed that at the beginning of this conversation as well, but you're validating that for us. So thank you. And then Michael wants us to a little bit get on the predictive side. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do that, can we talk a little bit about what signals to look for in data and how do you make sense of all of the data that exists in an organization already and how your customers are interacting with you?
Absolutely. So it starts with mapping out an ideal customer journey based on if you have segments, whether that be size, industry, use case. And you look at where do you want a customer to be at a certain point in time? For instance, how long does it take to implement for your typical customer to be successful? So the time to implementation becomes key. Then you look at what's the time to first value? So what do you define as the first value that someone's getting out of a product or out of a service? And how long is it taking to get there? And then you start to look at over time, what makes the product sticky? So typically, what's the % license utilization and those trends over time? And for instance, what does the advocacy look like? Are they participating in community or event forums? Combining all of these things together, I like to think of overall health numbers. The idea being that there's certain customers that in certain areas aren't meeting the needs and you need to intervene along the way. So you don't want to wait till 4-6 months in, again, till you were to do your typical NPS survey to find out, but you actually want to see, okay, the implementation is taking longer than expected to be successful. Let's intervene. There's typically playbooks and ways to get executive sponsorship or other subject matter expertise involved, or things to empower CSMs to do that they know what to do and when. Same thing with first value. If someone's not seeing it, what are the tips and tricks we can do to guide them there? Do they need more training and enablement? So giving this playbook to CSMs or the greater team to say, if this data doesn't look like this, try this. And, over time, that list grows because hopefully you're hiring people that you believe in and empower to come up with new ideas. And so hopefully the customer success team is learning, let's try this at this point in time, and we see this outcome, which makes them more successful. So I fully believe in intervening along the way, not waiting for a typical business review, which is a whole nother topic in itself, but rather intervening when you're seeing data. I also would say, I don't not believe in surveys. So we do use surveys. For instance, I use a survey after implementation is complete. So I use surveys at different points in the journey to measure how happy they are, but they're more pointed questions that identify how they're actually feeling and can give constructive feedback or opportunities to improve.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So we'll move from NPS scores to service in a moment, and then to QBRs, very different methodologies around both of those. But staying with that data theme for a moment, you identified some really good points around what kind of data to look for. And, I heard around adoption, around consumption, around advocacy. There's different metrics that one can establish. Time to value or time to first value. I think that's an important one that you called out. So the question I have, what are some of the challenges people can expect to find around data? And somewhat of a leading question. Hello, Marissa, but I'll ask anyway. But what's the value that you see in product usage data? In fact, like I recently saw a survey from TSIA that talked about how 85% of the signal on whether a customer is going to churn or not originates from just watching their behavior in your product. And, we see that in some of our data that we work with clients, that there's a pretty significant signal there. I would not have given it an 85% or 81%. I think somewhere in that range is kind of what they scored it at. But I'm just curious to get your perspective on what challenges do you expect to see when people are trying to aggregate data across these different data sources, and and maybe that's a second question, how valuable is product usage data in that context?
Yeah, I would say the first challenge you typically hear from anyone is, they don't have enough data or they don't trust the accuracy of it. And so I always say, you get out of it what you put in. So, the more you invest in collecting the right data in a platform to measure it successfully that you can trust is step number one. After that, I like to define benchmarks over time. So customers by segment or customers that look alike, this is the typical trend and this is what happens over time. That way you can set up early warning signs and flag them if you don't feel like they're on the normal trend line. Now, data always goes hand in hand with, some level of subjectivity. So if you do have a CSM or a person talking to them, you may know they have, for instance, a seasonal environment or, a change that's happening. And so it's really key to take both data, the relationship that you know about the customer and what you know about their business, and combine them to get that full picture. But really the comparison to other customers is where you get a lot of that meaty information that helps.
So benchmarking relative to other customers, really that's an opportunity. We see a lot of messiness in the data. We see a lot of TBDs and NAs in people's data. So that's a whole other conversation and a discussion of it itself. Okay, I want to get to the predictive part. So, you talked about having a predictive point of view on where there may be churn risk, where there may be growth opportunities in your data, and NPS is reactive. So if people are looking for a predictive methodology, what would that look like? And it's kind of building on Michael's question that he asked in the chat session a minute ago.
Yeah, so when you get really good at predicting what could happen with a customer, you're looking for drastic variances or changes in the data. So for instance, the most simple one I like to say is you had someone maybe champions logging in every single day into the platform, and all of a sudden now they're logging in monthly, right? There's something clearly happening here and you need to figure out what that is. So when you look at what has the trend been like, and is there a variation? Did utilization drop off? You had 90% of the population in the platform and now you have 40%. There's a risk there. So setting up flags based on changes and variations in the data allow you to have a flag to say, let's look into this more and see what's happening. And it could be nothing, but to me, that's being predictive than waiting for someone to say, yes, I'm no longer satisfied and I wouldn't recommend you.
Yeah, got it. Okay, great. Any questions from the audience as far as moving from a reactive approach to a predictive approach? And I think, kind of responding a little to what Michael just asked, which is if we move from a proactive to reactive approach, is there still remaining value in NPS? Curious to hear your perspective, Celia. I'll share mine after you go, but let's start with you.
Yeah, to some of the earlier points, I think you're still going to find that CEOs, board members, investors may still want NPS because to them, that's their ultimate benchmark of customers and benchmark across their portfolios or comparison points to how other companies are doing. So I'm not sure we can 100% get away with it, but I think it's really important that we educate these leaders and educate that this is one point in time and that this is one piece of data, but also this is what we're doing on the predictive side. So if it were up to me, yes, I would get rid of it. I would not ask NPS at all. But I do think that is still the benchmark people are using, and that there is some value in reporting that upwards until we find the next best-in-class standard that measures how our customers are doing and how that shows what type of company we are and how we treat our customers.
Yeah, spot on. And I think the key point that you just touched on that resonates for me in what I've experienced in my past experiences in tech and the tech business is, senior leaders, executives, investors, board members seek out the NPS score because it gives you a very aggregate level view of your install base that you're polling. And it gives you, it's relatively accurate. So if the score was X last time around and it's Y now, it's directionally accurate. It may not be accurate in the sense of a point in time measure, but as a trending measure, it sort of indicates the health of the install base in a very simple way. From my perspective, what I would tell anybody watching this show, if you are in a leadership position in your company, whether you're an investor, board member, CEO, founder, CS leader, CRO, start asking for product usage data. How is your customer using your product? To me, there is no better metric in terms of understanding what your customer is doing. If they're not logging in regularly, if they're not actually doing the right things in your product, they're not moving through a maturity curve of simple features to more complex features, if they're not seeing value, if they're not recommending, inviting others to participate in the reports that they're creating and sharing them out, you're probably not building the right product or not selling it to the right people. So start asking for product usage data. That could could be the best predictive signal you've got so far. Okay, let's shift gears. So Jen is actually making a really good point here around product market fit surveys, customer effort score. Jen, if you're open, not to put you on the spot, but would you be open to jumping into the conversation and maybe elaborating a little bit more on your question? I'm going to go ahead and open your line. If you're in a place that you're able to talk to us, just drop a yes into the chat session. Thank you. Here we go. Your line is now open, Jen. Go ahead.
Great. Everything that Celia is saying is just so spot on in terms of NPS, and many companies are what I consider to be forced to use NPS. I don't consider it best practice because it is really a B2C. It's so critical for B2C. You want to know if those shoes that Nike just put out, if they're really going to be viral. And if you're recommending them to grandma, they're going to be viral. They're going to be a hit, right? So that's what you want to know. Are you recommending it to friends, family, colleagues, that sort of thing? But, to Michael Roberts' point about getting predictive, right? And I mean, ultimately, yes, you can look at data as Celia is suggesting, but I think you also want to look at asking the right question at the right time to the right person. And if you're doing that, that helps you be more in the moment in terms of addressing the issue. So if you've just gotten through onboarding and you ask a customer effort score, like how easy was that? Your perception as a customer, how easy was it to onboard with us?
Yeah.
Then if there's something that needs to be fixed for that particular customer, but also for all of your customers. Where is the customer friction? So that's the right question at the right time to the right person, right? And then otherwise, I think Celia was also talking about setting up sort of success plans and how do you connect with, the executive sponsor. Again, NPS doesn't necessarily help with that. Success plans do. I feel like your investors don't understand what NPS is. They ask for your NPS score because they figure they should ask for something. If we could do a better job of educating the investors, then the CEO wouldn't blindly follow suit and say, hey, we got to get an NPS score over to the investors, which is all they're really trying to do.
Yeah.
We're just trying to make them happy. So anyway, the product market fit survey, I think, can really work beyond just the initial stages. I think that's a question you always want to ask, because you add products, you make your product more complex. It doesn't always fit with the marketplace. Sometimes you rest on your laurels and you don't develop your product enough. I think that, also works well. You can go with the must-have question, or you can, go with all the other ones. I just think that there are other questions, and also product market fit, I think, is the kind of thing that can work even if you're not a startup, and can be a standard bearer that applies to B2B that is more accurate. NPS, everybody has to follow up and say, what did you really mean by that? Because it's not the right question. So they don't know what you mean by that.
Great.
That's anyway, but Celia was totally talking best practices there.
Yeah.
You know,
Definitely.
making it work as much as you can.
I like the idea of a customer effort score that you brought up, Jan. I like the idea of a product market fit survey. I think those are topics in of itself for a conversation down the road. Celia, any thoughts on what Jan just called out? Any reactions or comments from your perspective?
Yes, such great additions, Jan. Really appreciate it. Absolutely. It's not that I don't believe in surveys at all. I think Jan makes a really good point. It's the right surveys at the right time to the right people, and you're still able to get that baseline, and you're still able to get a number to measure against. But it is actually that point in time that it's needed to ask that customer. So I love that.
Great.
Yeah.
Jen, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah. Okay, so Celia, I want to move to surveys as the next conversation point. You brought that up earlier. Tell me a little bit about how because I actually tried to do a survey, did a survey last year for ops people to better understand their role and what they do. And we got, I think, close to 100 responses that we packaged up as a white paper and shared with the community as well. But I'm curious, like, it was a horrendous process to go through. Like, there was so much nuance in trying to ask the right question and what responses to offer up, and how long do you make it? How short do you make it? Like, are people actually going to participate if it's too long? And then do you get real value out of it if it's too short? So lots of debate and discussion internally, but tell us how you use surveys in this context, and kind of moving off of NPS, moving off of predictive. Let's talk about surveys now.
Yeah, so coming from an employee engagement survey platform at Glint, did a lot of research on surveys, mostly internally, but a lot of it applies to customers as well. So you always like to think of the sweet spot. How much time is someone actually going to spend on this before they stop halfway through, before we have a drop-off rate? Sometimes you have to measure that over time, but typically that's 1 to 2 minutes. Our attention span, how busy people are. And so you start to think of, okay, 1 to 2 minutes, about how many seconds per question. Maybe you're at about 20, 30 seconds, and that starts to give you the number of questions. But for me, what's more important than, the time to get the highest response rate is, how do we get the most meaningful feedback at the right time? And so there usually needs to be the right mix of qualitative and quantitative data. So questions that have a direct measurement. For instance, the customer effort score is a great one. You're getting a number based on that. So you have something to compare to, but then you may also want 1 or 2, but not several, open-ended questions to also understand any feedback, opportunities, or great wins that you have as well. So to me, it's really important to have both the measurement number as well as the feedback, as you have something to action on and something to compare to internally to trend over time.
Yeah, I think you made several key points, but just in terms of how much time does it take to respond to the survey, the answer, what I heard was 1 TikTok. Like, if you can watch 1 TikTok or take a survey, your chances you're going to take the survey. But if it's longer than a TikTok, you're probably not going to take the survey. So that,
and most likely people are taking the survey as they're watching the TikTok, right?
That's right. Exactly right. So the attention economy, how do you grab attention and get people to engage, is a really important question, again, for a different episode of our podcast series here. But can you share some examples of where surveys have delivered useful, actionable, meaningful insights that your team was just like able to respond to, and it changed sort of the direction the business was headed?
Yeah, for me, one of the main ones that I really learned a lot from and were able to action was our post-implementation survey. So as soon as a customer was moved in their customer journey from having implemented the products, they finished their onboarding to an ongoing state, having a really pointed survey. So you could have customer effort score in there. I also like to measure things like their interaction with the person that they were working with, the expectations that they had from sales versus what they received. So really like to get in there and ask pointed questions about what they went through and how they feel about it, and get open feedback. And now you can share that with other teams and improve on things, whether you're improving on your sales handoff, whether you're improving on the resources that were provided, how easy they were to understand, the number of calls needed. So really like to ask questions that give me measurable data. And then based on that, it's so simple to be able to improve there. If 8 out of 10 customers are saying that they didn't feel like they had enough self-serve resources, we can create self-serve resources as a priority. So if anything, it helps you prioritize what to work on and when to improve your customers' likelihood of being happy.
Yeah, really. So, what I heard that I thought was very interesting is ask questions that will lead you to prioritize what you need to do for your clients, right? That's kind of a key point in that. Okay, any other questions from the audience as far as surveys, et cetera? Feel free to jump in. If you raise your hand, we'll open the mic and we'll let you. And raise your hand is an actual thing in Zoom for those not familiar. If you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a hand symbol. So you raise your hand, we'll see you over here and we open the mic to you. Okay, so let's move from surveys to QBRs. High touch, typically strategic accounts, typically quarterly, sometimes more often, but maybe take the audience through how you think about QBRs, when's the right time to do them, obviously an expensive process, how much should you invest into it, how do you make those choices?
Yeah, first and foremost, I have a really strong opinion about the term QBR, as it implies that every customer on a quarterly basis should have some type of review, and that's just not the case. Just like anything else, this depends on so many different things. So this can depend on everything like the size of the customer, the goals that you've set up with them, and the value that you expect to deliver in what period of time. So for me, my pet peeve about QBRs or business reviews is the idea that we think we're delivering value, we being the vendor or provider partner to a customer, because we're just throwing a bunch of data at them on a certain period of time and we feel like, okay, we've done our job. For me, figuring out what's in it for me as the customer is the most important factor. So as a customer, I've told you, let's hopefully in the pre-boarding stage, what my goals are, what I'm looking to accomplish, and what will make me successful. So hopefully what you're able to do then is at the frequency that you determine the customer should be on the way, in the delivery method the customer wants. Maybe it's an email, maybe it is a live call, maybe it's a different method, maybe it is in person for certain customers. But what's most valuable to them, you're able to show where you are on their success criteria. So the key here is the customer's success criteria, not the partner or the product success criteria. It's about them, not about you. Now, of course, there's opportunities to give tips and tricks to get them on track. There's opportunities to share a roadmap that may be helpful or relevant to their business or may drive upsell or expansion. But I think so many people fall to the idea of we're just going to throw all this data at you that we think is important, and we don't actually know if you care about it or not, but we did our job by delivering it. So there's a lot there, and a lot of different names come around to this. There'd be a value review, a success review. There's so many different ways to frame this, but I think agreeing with a customer in implementation, how often do you want to measure this success? How would you like to? And then doing that versus them feeling like they're joining another meeting. Who has time to join another meeting to not get something in it for them?
Exactly. So Celia, you packed so much into that brief statement. I think this idea that I took away from this, that it's about them, not about you, and having that empathy for your customer and what their success metrics and objectives are. And actually, Gary raised a question early on in the Q&A portion of the Zoom call along the same lines, which is establishing the success metrics early in the process and then measuring against those as you go through it. Very super valuable. I know we could unpack QBRs and surveys for a lot longer. We are unfortunately bumping up against our time. I want to thank the audience for your participation today. You've been amazing. You've been wonderful for all of the feedback that you just shared with us today. And we look forward to seeing you again. Well, next week, we're hosting a pre-recorded session since I will be on the road. You'll hear me talk about my journey as a founder. If you're interested in it, it'll land in your inbox. You're welcome to watch it and share your feedback with me. But then beyond next week, we'll go back to our regular programming. and have a new guest that you can join us with. Celia, you've been wonderful. Thank you for sharing your insights. Please stay on the call. For the audience, if you want to reach out to Celia, what's the best way to do that? Celia, where do they find you?
LinkedIn. Yeah. If you search my name on LinkedIn, would love to connect and continue the conversation with anyone, as this is something I'm very passionate about.
Spell your last name for everybody here so they can find
Yes. I won't make you memorize the pronunciation of Gouveia, but it's Gouveia. I'll also drop it here into the chat for those that are still here and would like to connect.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. And look forward to staying connected with each of you. Celia, if you don't mind, just stay on for a few minutes and we can catch up a little bit after the session.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.